Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Welcome back. Robby Soave is a senior editor at Reason. He enjoys writing about culture, politics, education policy, and criminal justice reform. He's the author of Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump, which is one of the topics of today's interview. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Before we get started, I would like to ask you a question that I ask all my guests, which is, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Sure. I've been thinking about that a little bit. I would say my advice would be try to spend as little time possible doing things you don't want to do, which sounds obvious, but I think to a lot of young people, or even like for myself, it's taken me a while to learn this. Like, you have a finite amount of time left in your life. And if you don't spend it doing tasks or projects or working towards something that doesn't matter to you, because you'll do a bad job anyway and you'll be unhappy. Like, if you don't want to be on a sports team, don't be on a sports team. If you don't want to study X thing in college, even if you think it would be better for yourself or whatever, just don't do it. You'll be better off just avoid it. Obviously, you can't do this all the time. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do, but your default should be to avoid it whenever possible. It will make you happier and more productive in the long run.
That's such good advice. I kind of learned that recently, very recently, and it's really easy to forget. So even if you already know it, listeners, here is a reminder. I don't know. I'm really bad at figuring out if I actually like to do something or not, but I definitely only want to do something if I want to do it. So it's kind of this weird conflict in my mind, but I don't know. I think that's good. That's a good thing for me to hear. Reminder.
Yeah, I think people need to hear. Like, there are people who wanted me to advise me I should probably have a podcast. That's what everybody's doing now. And maybe that makes sense for me, but I would not be good at having a podcast. I don't feel like doing it. I like going on other people's podcasts. I like having conversations like this, but I don't really want to have my own. So I'm just not going to do it. So that's like what I decided. And that's that.
Yeah, I can't think of any examples for me right now, but there definitely are a lot of things. Well, I guess I think of sports a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But okay, let's get started because I can't think of a good application in my life right now. So your book, you explore a piece of a puzzle that I have been figuring out for a while now. And I talked to Greg Lukianoff about it, and I talked to Jonathan Rauch about it. And it's really interesting to me because I'm about to go to college, and it's also my generation and the generation before mine. And so it's very relevant to me and to everyone around me, and I see it all the time, but I don't completely understand it. And I mean, you definitely I just told you a little bit ago, but I attended your book talk at Freedom Fest 2 years ago, and I didn't quite understand at the time how important it was, the movement that you were describing and that you describe in your book. So my first question is, why did you decide to write the book?
Sure. So I have been, or had been for several years, writing about kind of what was going on college campuses or higher education policy. And I became increasingly more interested in the kind of cultural side of campus life versus other policies, the free speech issues that were occurring on college campuses. If you've talked to Lukianoff and some of those people, they've written about a lot of the same things, but this emerging climate on campuses that was not, from our perspective, conducive to the kind of free exchange of ideas that you would expect on a college campus. That's how it was when I was on campus. I went to the University of Michigan. I graduated in 2010. And there, you would have speakers, conservative speakers, liberal speakers. They would come to campus. There were all sorts of different clubs. That's still obviously happening on college campuses, but there were more and more incidents over the last few years of people being shouted down or chased out or censored, lightly muzzled in some way. And I wrote the book to try to understand why that was happening, what are the trends behind it. And I really came away with the idea that there is a new idea among some young people, not all young people, but some young people, the kinds of people who were uncomfortable with speech from conflicting viewpoints on campus, who think that speech, if it offends, if it wounds in an emotional sense, is itself is like an act of violence akin to being physically violent, and thus it can and should be prevented, which has a lot of broader social implications and is kind of counter to the norms of free speech that we've arrived at in the preceding decades. So I think it's a interesting and dire trend that I describe in greater length in the book.
So, who are these young radicals that are hurt by words, and how are they different from radicals of the past?
Sure. So radicals of the past, so even on college campuses, the kind of student activist types, if you went back further, were, even if they were very much people on the left, they tended to be vehemently pro-free speech. In fact, the 60s activists, racial equality activists, anti-war activists, those types of people were by necessity hardcore First Amendment people. They wanted all sorts of offensive speech to be allowed. In fact, they led a movement at Berkeley, was where this was concentrated, to rescind the censorious policies of the University of California administration that had put limits on what kind of political speech could take place on campus. They were absolutely for totally unfettered free speech. They even the liberal students, the very left-leaning students, did this. They invited a literal member of the Nazi Party to campus as a free speech stunt, just to prove the point that we think anyone should be able to talk on campus for any reason. And that was the mindset of sort of the left, the radical students, going back to the 60s and 70s. Something has changed in the years since then. Today, and again, this isn't, I'm never castigating all young people or painting with a broad brush or saying there's large numbers of people who are like this, but there's a certain kind of young student on campus who is often very wealthy and very privileged, and you would think very immune from being wounded so easily, but they assert that it is their right to protect campus, and this is more concentrated at the more elite, the more privileged, the more expensive, the more selective the college, the more likely it is to have a significant number of these problems, where they think that anyone, even like a mild conservative talking on campus, is a threat to someone's safety.
Are these radicals just on the left?
They are certainly not just on the left. In my book, I talk. I talk about all sorts of kind of the radical characters of the Trump generation. So the problems I'm identifying with speech, I think, are very unique to the left. They're interesting because the left used to be very good on free speech and isn't so good anymore. I'm not sure I've noticed quite the equivalent trend on the right, just because there's vastly fewer right-leaning students on campuses. They have very little power to do anything. There is certainly a strain of militantly illiberal young right-leaning students. The kind of student activists on the right of this generation tend to be very nationalist and populist and socially conservative, and not as much in the kind of libertarian mode, which is how they were when I was on campus a decade or two ago. And I think there's certainly less of an interest in free speech for the principles of free speech, and more just in we have to be for free speech because we're in the minority, but if we were not in the minority, we would totally censor the other side. And there's also a lot of just kind of performative nonsense that's just not tied to any broader ideology, but it's just kind of like the troll the left ethos, or the make the libs cry ethos that is very prevalent among some of the right-wing activists these days.
A recurring theme in your book is the concept of intersectionality. You note that intersectionality is the operating system of the modern left. You also note that you don't have a problem with the concept in general, but your issue is with the way it's applied to activism. Can you explain what it is and how it's become a problem?
Sure. So the theory of intersectionality, which came to us from a thinker named Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s, she was trying to describe the effect of having different sources of oppression working against a person. So if you're Black, historically, Black people have faced racial oppression. Women historically have faced gender-based oppression. But what if you're a Black woman? Then you have two different sources of oppression that have worked against, maybe not you specifically, but among people who fit those identity groups. So that will be different than someone who has just faced one or the other. So that's really all intersectionality is, and that's kind of like that's a simplistic observation that I think like everyone would agree is true. Like, it's not even making a very strong claim. But then, of course, there are other reasons an identity group, a category, could have faced oppression. Could be related to your sexuality. Could be related to your class or your access to wealth. Could be related to your gender identity. Could be related to your age, your size, your religion, your all sorts of things. So there has been a tendency among people on the left to really intersectionality has become very kind of in vogue, kind of like a cool thing to talk about, I think. So there's been a desire to make all issues about, okay, what are the relevant identity group levels of power here? Whereas historically, really the only one the left cared about was class. Class was the entire thing. And now there's a strong preference for analysis based on what's like the relevant racial oppression kind of thing. I think this can tend to be kind of reductive and kind of short-sighted, because there's also a lot of related tactical things with this, like, well, on such an issue, we want to really only listen to the people the group that is most oppressed by fitting this issue. And like, if you're not part of that group, you should probably fall back and be quiet. But at the same time, we're not asking the oppressed people to be the experts or to educate us about it. There's just a lot of like contradictory, strategic, tactical things that are not necessarily part of the theory itself, which again, I think is fine, but go along with it, are accompanying it, that just seems like counterproductive at best to me. So that's why I'm not a fan.
It does seem counterproductive. And I mean, as I read into this more and as I look more and more, I just keep thinking, wow, that can't be right. They're hurting themselves in this process, aren't they? But we will get to that later. I have an idea about something I want to ask, but I have another question I want to ask first. So, you talk about the shift from how kind of like the norm of safety in culture and in parenting, and how that's changed and how that has contributed to the behavior of young radicals. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I always try to be careful with this one, because I think this is a plausible explanation. It's not backed up with like data, so it's just kind of my guess for how things shook out. But it is totally the case that there is more coddling of young people, of very young people, by their parents, by the schools, by the state, in the K through 12 environment. I mean, safetyism is just like crazy in schools, because, and it makes no sense, because schools are like very, very safe. I think the mass shooting scares of the 90s and onward really freaked people out and made people think that like kids are sitting ducks in schools and there's all this violence in schools. There really isn't. Schools are pretty safe. There's not been that many shootings in schools. If you were to go back to the 1970s, you wouldn't find any police in schools. Now, like half of all public high schools have police officers. There's this idea that there's just a crazy amount of crime and violence that must be countered. So that's gotten more intense. And also now you can get arrested for letting your kids walk to school by themselves or like babysit themselves, play in the backyard by themselves. This happens all the time. Child services is called on people all the time for very silly reasons. So this is the kind of like helicopter parenting thing, which is described. It's real. It's gotten so much worse, not just because of people's like free decisions, but because of the incentives, because of laws passed by government, how schools have changed. So my theory would be that that's had an effect of, one, convincing people that the world is more dangerous than it is, that schools are more dangerous than they are, and that the authority figures exist to provide you protection and comfort from safety to a very unreasonable degree. So I think it's a short jump from there to the position that, well, I feel threatened by this speech that offends me. Aren't you supposed to do something about that? So that's my guess.
Those laws are ridiculous. I mean, I kind of knew, but like I didn't really think about it because I don't know. I guess I've never had a kid. I've never had to deal with that sort of thing. Do you know when those laws were put into place?
Yeah. So it's the 90s. This all starts getting much worse. So crime was increased very like dramatically in the period before the 90s. The murder rate was high up until about 1992, 1993, and then it immediately just like drops. It's funny because we talk about how we act like everything's really bad now, and in many ways it actually is really bad now. But the murder rate, the gun homicide rate, all measures of violence, they declined, like they fell in half from 1992 to like 10 years later. There's just this, and there's all sorts of interesting explanations for why that might be the case. But anyway, there was actually a lot of violence still in society at the beginning of the 90s. So then you saw all sorts of kind of policy responses that I actually don't think had anything to do with the decline. But yeah, so there was all of a sudden more cops in schools, like the Columbine shooting, which happened at the end of the 90s, really freaked everybody out about bullying in schools and how that would turn kids into like maniacs and they start shooting each other. Again, even though this is like a very, very, very small category of crime. So kidnappings became a big concern. I don't know if you've ever heard of, they used to do this, right? They'd put kids' pictures on milk cartons, like missing kids. So then there became this pervasive fear. There was a lot of local news coverage of kidnapping. So there became this pervasive, like if you turned your back on a child for 5 seconds, that's it. They're gone. They're going to get snatched. You'll never see them again. All of this did not fit with the reality whatsoever. The kidnappings are almost always the work of a family member, or like in a custody dispute or a runaway. The child abducted by total stranger, which is every episode of like Law and Order. That is so, it happens. It is a big world with a lot of people in it. It certainly happens. It is so rare. But we have all these policies now to make sure it never happens. So that was part of it. A panic about crime, really disconnected from what the actual categories of crime that were occurring. That was because it was portrayed by the media, by news, by kind of popular culture, etc. So that's kind of the story of what happened there. It's very interesting.
I was gonna bring up TV and how watching crime shows, it's always 13 kids have been abducted over 8 years by a pair of people that wanted to put them and play house with them. And I was like, I can't watch that stuff because it makes me think that the world is so much worse than it is and that all that stuff is completely normal and like frequently occurring. And I don't know, I just have had to stop because I know that it's insane. I know that that's like it's awful and it happens, but it doesn't happen every day, which
Right.
is, I don't know. That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Exactly. I mean, again, there's 7 billion people on this planet. It does happen, but it's just, if you look at the statistics, it's absolutely the case. Most kidnappings, runaway or family member in a custody dispute. And local news coverage of these things is always so bad, or you hear that, oh no, there's a I've seen you'll see local news segments. It's like, oh, a sex offender lives in this neighborhood. How dare they? It's terrible. Well, but if you look at the statistics, that most people are on the sex offender registry because they urinated in public, or they themselves are a teenager who had an incident with another teenager. The image of the predatory older person or something. Again, it happens. It's terrible, but they're trying to scare you into thinking this is very, very common when it's not.
So, kind of back to college kids, young radicals. You talk about their fondness for trigger warnings, and I remember when I think I was in middle school, and trigger warning was such a funny thing that we'd just pass around because for us, we were so young, it didn't mean anything. We were like, oh, that's silly. Oh my gosh, you're talking about fish? You should have put a trigger warning on that. And we kind of made fun of it, but people take it super seriously. And you've talked about how it can be invoked regarding anything that could be uncomfortable. If fish is an uncomfortable topic for someone, you could actually be forced to have some sort of trigger warning on that. So, can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so they became very widespread. Particularly, you haven't gotten there yet, but particularly in college, I think maybe they're becoming unwidespread. There's been some science, there's been some actual research that strongly suggests you should not use them. But the idea is that people have PTSD, people have trauma, and you don't want to, remind them of their trauma. So you want to provide them some warning that they're about to engage with content in a classroom setting or in a discussion that is going to call to mind their past trauma. The problem with this is you're kind of expanding the concept beyond actual. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress, is a thing, and people have it. People who have fought in combat or been in violent situations, they can have this condition. But one of the ways you overcome it is actually by gradual exposure to the kind of thing you're scared of. But it usually isn't that exact thing that necessarily triggers your PTSD. It will be like a smell or a word or a memory triggers it in some way. So to actually forewarn you of that is hard because you wouldn't necessarily know you're going to encounter something like, oh, banana, but banana reminds me of, when I was in Fallujah or something. It's not going to be easy to plan out. So what's actually happening is just a lot of very easily offended, vulnerable people are claiming that ideas they don't want to engage because they don't like them or they disagree with them is the same thing. They're triggered by them. They don't want to have to deal with them. And that's kind of an abuse of the concept. It's not helpful. Also, there have now been so many, 3 or 4, I've written about every one of them, separate studies where people did research, and what they have found over and over again is that use of trigger warnings does not correlate with a better mental health outcome. In fact, they found that it just made people more alarmed because if you tell them, oh, you're about to be really disturbed by this, you heighten their anxiety anyway. So they're really not helpful. And I think professors should be able to organize their classrooms however they want. But here's a case where the science, what we know, clearly shows this nice idea, but it hasn't really panned out, and it doesn't really seem particularly useful or good.
I don't know why this is what I thought of right when you were saying that, but it's kind of like if you get a text, or if someone in the middle of a school or work day is like, I have to talk to you about something later. Okay, you're going to spend the rest of your day worrying about that.
100%. Yeah, the we need to talk text. What? No smiley face emoji? No exclamation point? What? Who has cancer? Who was in a car accident? It worries you.
And I don't know. That's exactly just what I thought about. And I don't know why I never thought of it before, but just something that you said just made it click. And I don't know, it just makes so much sense that it wouldn't be helpful at all.
That's
and
a great
example.
Actually, I'm going to steal that one. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. So these students who are super vulnerable, there are a lot of them on college campuses, but most of them that create the massive disruptions, it's a small number, a small percentage of students. And you have lots of examples of this in your book about activists who go after people and use violence and cause disruption just because they don't want to hear someone speak or they don't want to see someone even like doing anything at their college or whatever. For instance, you talked about what happened to Kimberly Pierce, who directed the movie Boys Don't Cry, and how and what went down when she visited Reed College. And the movie is about Brandon Tina, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He's a trans man, and it was his struggle to find himself and how he was beaten up for being trans. And I feel like even just hearing a synopsis of that, it sounds like a sympathetic movie about trans issues, right? And like that topic. But she got in big trouble when she went to Reed College. So can you tell us that story and explain why she got in trouble?
Yeah, it's just so insane. So you outlined the scenario perfectly. This is a movie where you feel sympathetic for the trans person at the heart of it. This is a movie, by the way, from the 90s, which is not like the Stone Ages or something, but actually in terms of acceptance of trans people, it kind of was. At that time, if trans people were depicted in films, it was often in a very sinister way. Probably the villain of The Silence of the Lambs was the best known trans character in a film at the time. So this was a positive portrayal. It was a good thing. But for today's activists, it's not a positive portrayal because the character is played by Hilary Swank, who is a woman. And with the new, again, this is the intersectional identity politics kind of framing of it, is that only an actual trans person should have played that role. And it was harmful and abusive and emotionally manipulative and offensive for it to be a cis woman who played the character. So when Kimberly Pierce, the director, the creator of the film, went to speak and herself being I'm not quite sure how she identifies, but does not fall along into a binary kind of, I can't remember if she's a lesbian or if she doesn't identify as a man or a woman. Anyway, you would think this was someone like left pro-trans activist type people would not hate. They screamed at her when she tried to speak. They left her really awful notes all over the podium where she was going to speak. They yelled obscenities at her. They called her all sorts of awful names. Like it was crazy because they're saying that she like by creating this movie, again, a pro-trans movie with a positive portrayal of a trans person, she had engaged in literal violence against trans people because it wasn't exactly up to the standards of 2017.
And the other thing is, who is to say that she didn't look for a trans actor to be in the movie? Most of the time, when I see stuff like this, I kind of look into it more and I'm like, oh, well, why are they mad? And it seems to be that it's about something that they don't know if there was an attempt to do it a certain way and it just didn't go through or not. It just seems to like you see it, and if it's immediately something you don't like or you feel uncomfortable with, it's just out. Nope, canceled. I don't even want to hear about it.
Right. I mean, it's really weird with acting too, because it's like the whole idea of acting is like you're supposed to, like you're trying to portray someone who's not you and like do that to the best of your ability. So the idea that we would always have to cast someone from like the same narrow category, like I think it's good to give more acting opportunities to people who don't like who aren't the same sort of most famous people, I guess. But part of acting itself is kind of reaching outside that, and also these complaints are often just like very, very uninformed about who the person is. Like so, recently they were complaining that they being kind of people who complain online that Gal Gadot is going to play Cleopatra in the new movie about Cleopatra. And they're like, how dare they not get like an Egyptian or an African person? But of course, Cleopatra was from the ruling dynasty of Egypt that was actually from Greece, I think. So the fact that and Gal Gadot is a Middle Eastern person or from, so it's like it's actually, the casting actually fits perfectly fine if you're being at least a little generous. But no one screaming their heads off about that knows anything about this subject.
And it seems so self-defeating, as you kind of talked about a little bit earlier. I mean, especially when the story must have been monumental, the movie, just because it's the first good depiction of transgender people. And you would think that people will understand this or at least see it if it's explained to them. And even when Charles Murray, who is a conservative scholar at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, visited Middlebury College, he was attacked by students because they thought that he shouldn't be allowed to talk there. And Allison Stranger, who is a professor there who invited him, she's on the left and she doesn't agree with him, but she thought it would be interesting to debate with him. And I mean, of course, I assume she wanted to prove him wrong, but she ended up injured because of that idea. And I feel like that just doesn't make students look good. And it makes Charles Murray, it makes you sympathize with him, even if you disagree, I would think. So do you think that students realize the counterproductivity of their actions?
So when I talk about this a lot in the book, I posed that exact question to them, and I said I laid it out just as you did just now. Don't you think you look less sympathetic, and Charles Murray or whoever it is more sympathetic? When you're the one shouting, "F you" at him and shutting off the lights while he's trying to speak. And they said, "Okay, I get that, but that's not the point." Because they're not trying to look sympathetic, or they're not, trying to convince people they're right. They're framing it as, but if he speaks, or whoever it is speaks, then harm will be perpetrated against marginalized people in our community who we care about. So we are going to stop that harm regardless. It's not a strategic decision. It's a literal public safety defense.
And in your book, you also talk about how lots of professors are scared and terrified of their students because of this sort of thing. What are the consequences on an institution or even on the education you receive when the faculty is scared of the students?
Yeah, I mean, it's very bad. Faculties are afraid to tackle difficult subjects in the classroom, and they absolutely are. Not all of them, but in many cases. I talk to faculty all the time who tell me they'll avoid subjects because they think there's going to be an investigation, and they're quite right. There's been a number of them. It's trivially easy for a student to make a sort of HR type complaint that their right to an equal educational opportunity, it has been threatened by someone saying the wrong thing in the classroom. This is happening all the time, and it's bad because the universities are supposed to be at the most like speech out there place where you could express any idea, and and then you'll be challenged on it, and you'll have these like debates and discussions. It's really that's the idea of a university, and we really are moving away from that to a noticeable degree. Not entirely. There's still lots of interesting, productive conversations going on, I'm sure. But I mean, the faculty tell me they are nervous. They tell me all the time, and these aren't like all like hidden conservative faculty or something that are afraid to make their ideas known. These are liberal faculty who tell me this. Ones who are more in that '60s mindset of like, no, we're going to allow odious speech to be heard, and we're going to just challenge it. And they're afraid that they don't quite know what they're somewhat out of step with the requirements of modern intersectionality, and that their heads are on the chopping block.
Do you have any suggestions or any advice about, I don't know, people my age or just people in general, how to engage with people like this? Is it even worth it? Is there any gain from it? Is there a good way to approach that sort of conversation?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think engaging people is always good. Do it gently and carefully, because some people, and this isn't just young people, this is all people now, and not all people are like this, but this could happen at any age group. People really have hair triggers. They get really upset easily. So it's no fun to feel like you're walking on eggshells all the time, but you kind of want to ease yourself into difficult conversations, just in case, especially in the workplace now. This same kind of climate has jumped from campuses to media institutions, social media companies. I've actually been amazed this summer at how many people have had to depart prominent publications, newspapers, magazines. These people being sort of liberals who somehow irked or provoked some younger staff member on one of these issues, and it becomes an HR nightmare. So be very careful. It's not advice I want to give, but it's the reality is that you just have to be very careful these days.
Yeah, I mean, especially when your job is at stake. And kind of speaking of things at stake, this is a good transition into Title IX.
Hmm.
Um, so, something I read recently from a piece of yours in Reason was about Title IX, and it's also in the book. And the Obama administration's rules around Title IX and the Education Amendments of 1972. So what is Title IX? How did the Obama administration change it, and how does it play a role in everything that we see on campus today?
Sure. So Title IX is a federal law that obligates that forbids sexual discrimination, misconduct in public colleges, universities, schools, any school that receives public funds. Good. So it was a good, well-intended law to discourage mistreatment of or unequal treatment between men and women. If you have if you had a male sports team, you had to have a female sports team if there was comparative interest, that kind of thing. What happened is during the Obama years, it became it acquired deliberately by the bureaucrats working in the education department. They decided to force colleges and universities to comply with it to a much greater degree. And what they said was that a broader category of misconduct would fall under this law, and that it needed to be addressed, and it needed to be addressed using principles, investigatory procedures that I think, and have argued to this day, were kind of unfair if you were accused of something. They would say they wanted a single administrator looking into this, deciding if you were guilty. There were not going to be lawyers. There was not going to be cross-examination. Very kind of like extrajudicial. And these are not proper court procedures anyway. So there was some debate over, well, do we have to do the kind what the Bill of Rights would have you do in a courtroom? And actually, a lot of courts, when then the accused person sues, they've been expelled, they sue, it goes to court, and the courts have kind of said, yeah, these procedures were pretty unfair. And now again, we're talking about some cases of actual sexual assault being adjudicated, but also just a lot of, according to the education department's guidelines for what would violate Title IX, we were also talking about speech in a lot of categories, because it was anything that would make you feel uncomfortable, that was remotely had something to do with sex or gender. So, well, that could be, speaking to what we were just talking about, that could be in the classroom. If you're talking about a Shakespeare play with a sexual assault scene, or if you're talking about sexual assault in the law in a law school classrooms, I've talked to professors who told me they stopped covering this aspect of the law because they were afraid if it made a student upset, that could be a Title IX issue and they'd be investigated, which is just terrible. So it became a big a problem from a due process standpoint if you were accused, and also a free speech issue because you couldn't have conversations on the subject, or you could, but it might get you in trouble. There might be an investigation. Even if it was baseless, there could be an investigation. So this was bad. And one of the Trump administration policies that I most approve of, there aren't that many, but one of them was certainly the new education department revised their interpretation of this law so that it covers fewer things and there is more due process in the incidents as they're investigated.
What were the impacts of the change that was kind of put in place?
There was a climate of fear on so many campuses that you say anything, it's going to be Title IX. It's going to be Title IX, Title IX, Title IX. The activists figured this out. There's an activist group called Know Your Nine. They have the Roman numeral 9 tattooed to their ankles, and they just try to get people in trouble for saying things they don't agree with, or for advocating for less favorable policies for people accused of more serious things. And this is not to say that sexual misconduct or even sexual harassment is not a problem on many campuses, and it should be dealt with accordingly. But man, were some of these procedures unfair, where there was just no meaningful way for the other person to defend themselves. I've covered cases where the person, the student, had no idea what they were even being accused of because they weren't allowed to peruse the records. They weren't told to consult an attorney. It's just like very basically unfair stuff, which is largely where the courts arrived on this when it eventually makes it to that level. I mean, the judges look at this and go, are you kidding me? You can't do this. So it was quite bad. And again, the speech implication is serious. I remember, or some college, I think City University of New York, they sent guidance to professors and they said, please stop using gendered salutations like Mr. or Mrs. because that could be a Title IX issue, which is not true. Title IX does not prohibit that, but that's the level of overcompliance that university bureaucracies were going to such great lengths as a result of the Obama era interpretation.
That's pretty astonishing. Can you give us a brief summary of what it looked like and what it looks like now? The sort of investigation and I don't know. Yeah, that.
Yeah, so they urged when there's an accusation of a Title IX matter. So universities all now have Title IX departments or compliance officers, and what the Obama administration dictate was that we'd prefer if you just have one person. We're not even going to have a hearing panel. You're going to have one person investigate these charges, decide what the charges are, decide who are the relevant witnesses, who should be interviewed. So I remember cases where a student told me later, well, I had evidence, but I tried to present it, and the investigator said, well, no, I get to decide what evidence I'm considering. So I don't care about your neighbor or your roommate or their testimony because I get to decide whether I'm going to interview that person, and I'm deciding I'm not. So it's like getting very into sort of like Orwellian kind of dystopia trial situation where it's just like impossible to prove your innocence. And then there were often finding, there's serious harm to be accused of something like this and to be kicked off campus or to have to suspend your education for years, tremendous financial harm. Some of this is relevant, by the way, now in how the adjudication is going for people who violate COVID policies on campuses. I've written a little bit about that as well. Like I think I wrote about a student who it was a New York university. It might have been New York University itself. It was a university in New York, and they're simply using the Title IX playbook. They said, well, you went to a party, off campus, and that's forbidden. He's like, well, it was off campus. I'm a remote student, so I shouldn't have to follow this rule. And it was safe. I wore a mask or something. And within 24 hours, they decided, nope, sorry, you're gone, you're out, you're expelled. So, but this is absolutely coming out of the Title IX mindset for how these things were handled.
And that's wild. I mean, I can't imagine. I don't even know because I didn't know that this was a super big issue at all. Like, I would just assume that it works. Because, I mean, sexual misconduct, sexual assault, all of that stuff is super important. And so you would think, oh, the intention's good. I hope it works. Like, of course, if they change it, you would think that's going to make it work. But then the single investigator model doesn't follow due process. So it's kind of, I don't even know, it's kind of crazy just to think about it. And I mean, you wrote in your piece at Reason that now Biden has promised to reverse it yet again, back to the way it was under Obama. And you also said that the administration might have a hard time undoing these reforms. So can you kind of talk about that and explain what you mean?
Yeah, it will be somewhat hard to undo because so when the Obama administration came out with their new implementation, they just declared it. They didn't go through the process. So what they said is, well, this is what we think you have to do, you being the colleges and universities. If you don't agree, well, that's fine. We're not saying you have to. We're just saying we think you have to. So you can choose not to follow this, and then we can yank your funding, and then we'll go to court and find out. So, of course, all the colleges and universities said, nope, we'll just do what you tell us to do. The Trump administration, when they were trying to undo this declaration, did it differently. They sat down with, they went through the regulatory process, rulemaking. So they said, okay, this is what we actually think Title IX means. So we're going to solicit a lot of feedback. We're going to go through this process. It took years, and at the end of it, they say, okay, so here's what you actually have to do. And this is not just us saying we think you have to do this. You actually have to do this because we went through the whole Procedure Act to get there. So the Biden people can't just, so they could do that as well, and that will take years, and maybe they will. If they said, no, this is still wrong, you don't have to follow this, then colleges and universities so they could say, okay, we're not going to follow it. But then if they get sued, it's going to be very bad for the colleges and universities because the courts will say, no, the government already said this is what you had to do. We don't care that the Biden administration said we don't actually care if you do it. So it's going to be a little hard to undo it. They might find a way. There might be some strategy I'm not aware of. And there's still lots of problems with how it's being adjudicated by the actual people on campuses. But I think the new rule itself will hold up for at least a while.
I mean, I respect going through the process. I think that is important. The process is there for a reason.
And they could also by the way, they could also just right. They could if you could make a new law. You could write a new law that said no, Title IX is now this. Like there's nothing to prevent a Congress from doing a new law about this subject and having a president sign it. It's just that's never going to happen because I mean that could happen if Biden has a congressional majority, but I think we probably need a Senate supermajority because of the filibuster. No legislation can actually happen because of the dysfunction of the parties, which is really fine by me. But anyway.
So, kind of to wrap this up, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
That's a good one. So here's what I would say to that. I used to think I really bought into the idea that things were always getting better on many different levels. I was a big fan, and still am, a big fan of Steven Pinker, who has who wrote a great book about the decline of violence. A little bit like what I told you about earlier. There was this massive decline in homicides and other things from the early 90s until now. Globally, violence has declined on like a massive time frame from antiquity to the Middle Ages to now. When I grew up in the 90s, I was born in 88, and the 90s were like this like the golden era of everything being kind of just great. Warfare was like consigned to certain areas of the globe that are far away. The economy was like really, really good. There was a lot of social cohesion. It was just good times. I don't know how else to explain it. Like things just seemed good. And because that was the time I was a young person, it seemed like the natural state of the world. Like there were bad times in the past, but they're over. Everything's good now. That has become increasingly difficult to still believe because the last few years have been years of like just extreme political strife. And there has been, not for the last 4 years, but before that, there was like heavy economic dysfunction. Now there is again heavy economic dysfunction. I never could have imagined something as horrible as this pandemic happening. The theory that like things are just always getting better no longer. It's now. I used to think things were just getting better. Now I think, okay, yes, things can get better, but they can also like suddenly veer in a very, very, very dark way, which is kind of what we're going through now, and it sucks. But no, we should not just be. I used to be just always optimistic about the future because of the era in which I grew up. But now the era in which I grew up seems like a kind of unique moment in history that is certainly not destined to repeat itself. I hope it is, but there's nothing to assert that it will necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard right now, especially. I know that. And like just in general to see, especially because right now what we see is what's in front of us. So I know in general, I mean, if we zoom out and like think, or not even think, just see like 100 years in the future, it probably will be better, I would think. But who knows? I feel like it's much less of a linear or even exponential. There are like times where it like divots downward. And like, I don't know, I hope we see the upward trend soon.
I hope so too.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being on my podcast. I really enjoyed talking with you and I learned so much, and I know my listeners will also learn so much from listening to this, and I don't know, it's just fun. So thank you, even though it's like a pretty heavy topic, like it's kind of rough, but I don't know, it was a good time. So thank you so much. And yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.